This is Section 1 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2, by Mark Twain. Section 1, A Curious Experience, Part 1. Read by John Greenman. This is the story which the Major told me, as nearly as I can recall it. In the winter of 1862-3, I was commandant at Fort Trumbull, at New London, Connecticut. It may be our life there was not so brisk as life at the front. Still, it was brisk enough in its way. One's brains didn't cake together there for want of something to keep them stirring. For one thing, all the northern atmosphere at that time was thick with mysterious rumors to the effect that rebel spies were flitting everywhere, and getting ready to blow up our northern forts, burn our hotels, send infected clothing into our towns, and all that sort of thing. You remember it. All that had a tendency to keep us awake, and knock the traditional dullness out of our garrison life. Besides, ours was a recruiting station, which is the same as saying we didn't have any time to waste in dozing or dreaming or fooling around. Why, with all our watchfulness, 50% of a day's recruits would leak out of our hands and give us the slip the same night. The bounties were so prodigious that a recruit could pay a sentinel $300 or $400 to let him escape, and still have enough of his bounty money left to constitute a fortune for a poor man. Yes, as I said before, our life was not drowsy. Well, one day I was in my quarters alone, doing some writing, when a pale, ragged lad of 14 or 15 entered, made a neat bow, and said, "I believe recruits are received here?" "Yes." "Will you please enlist me, sir?" "Dear me, no. You are too young, my boy, and too small." A disappointed look came into his face, and quickly deepened into an expression of despondency. He turned slowly away, as if to go, hesitated, then faced me again, and said in a tone which went to my heart, "I have no home, not a friend in the world. If you could only enlist me—" But of course the thing was out of the question, and I said so as gently as I could. Then I told him to sit down by the stove and warm himself, and added, "You shall have something to eat presently. You are hungry?" He did not answer. He did not need to. The gratitude in his big soft eyes was more eloquent than any words could have been. He sat down by the stove, and I went on writing. Occasionally I took a furtive glance at him. I noticed that his clothes and shoes, although soiled and damaged, were of good style and material. This fact was suggestive. To this I added the facts that his voice was low and musical, his eyes deep and melancholy, his carriage and address gentlemanly. Evidently the poor chap was in trouble. As a result, I was interested. However, I became absorbed in my work by and by, and forgot all about the boy. I don't know how long this lasted, but at length I happened to look up. The boy's back was toward me, but his face was turned in such a way that I could see one of his cheeks, and down that cheek a rill of noiseless tears was flowing. "God bless my soul," I said to myself, "I forgot the poor rat was starving." Then I made amends for my brutality by saying to him, "Come along, my lad, you shall dine with me. I am alone today." He gave me another of those grateful looks, and a happy light broke in his face. At the table he stood with his hands on his chair-back until I was seated, then seated himself. I took up my knife and fork, and I simply held them, and kept still, for the boy had inclined his head and was saying a silent grace. 1,000 hallowed memories of home and my childhood poured in upon me, and I sighed to think how far I had drifted from religion and its balm for hurt minds, its comfort and solace and support. As our meal progressed, I observed that young Wicklow (Robert Wicklow was his full name) knew what to do with his napkin, and, well, in a word, I observed he was a boy of good breeding, never mind the details. He had a simple frankness, too, which won upon me. We talked mainly about himself, and I had no difficulty in getting his history out of him. When he spoke of his having been born and reared in Louisiana, I warmed to him decidedly, for I had spent some time down there. I knew all the coast region of the Mississippi and loved it, and had not been long enough away from it for my interest in it to begin to pale. The very names that fell from his lips sounded good to me, so good that I steered the talk in directions that would bring them out: Baton Rouge, Plaquemine, Donaldsonville, 60-Mile Point, Bonnet Carrey, the Stock Landing, Carrollton, the steamship landing, the steamboat landing, N'Orleans, Chapatoula Street, the Esplanade, Rue des Bons Enfants, the St. Charles Hotel, the Tivoli Circle, the Shell Road, Lake Pontchartrain, and it was particularly delightful to me to hear once more of the R.E. Lee, the Natchez, the Eclipse, the General Quitman, the Duncan F. Kenner, and other old familiar steamboats. It was almost as good as being back there, these names so vividly reproduced in my mind the looks of things they stood for. Briefly, this was little Wicklow's history. When the war broke out, he and his invalid aunt and his father were living near Baton Rouge, on a great rich plantation which had been in the family for 50 years. The father was a Union man. He was persecuted in all sorts of ways, but clung to his principles. At last, one night, masked men burned his mansion down, and the family had to fly for their lives. They were hunted from place to place, and learned all there was to know about poverty, hunger, and distress. The invalid aunt found relief at last. Misery and exposure killed her. She died in an open field, like a tramp, the rain beating upon her and the thunder booming overhead. Not long afterwards the father was captured by an armed band, and while the son begged and pleaded, the victim was strung up before his face. At this point a baleful light shone in the youth's eyes, and he said, with the manner of one who talks to himself, "If I cannot be enlisted, no matter, I shall find a way." As soon as the father was pronounced dead, the son was told that if he was not out of that region within 24 hours it would go hard with him. That night he crept to the riverside and hid himself near a plantation landing. By and by the Duncan F. Kenner stopped there, and he swam out and concealed himself in the yawl that was dragging at her stern. Before daylight the boat reached the Stock Landing, and he slipped ashore. He walked the 3 miles that lay between that point and the house of an uncle of his in Good Children Street, in New Orleans, and then his troubles were over for the time being. But his uncle was a Union man, too, and before very long he concluded that he had better leave the South. So he and young Wicklow slipped out of the country on board a sailing vessel, and in due time reached New York. They put up at the Astor House. Young Wicklow had a good time of it for a while, strolling up and down Broadway, and observing the strange northern sights. But in the end a change came, and not for the better. The uncle had been cheerful at first, but now he began to look troubled and despondent. Moreover, he became moody and irritable, talked of money giving out and no way to get more, not enough left for one, let alone two. Then, one morning, he was missing, did not come to breakfast. The boy inquired at the office, and was told that the uncle had paid his bill the night before and gone away. To Boston, the clerk believed, but was not certain. The lad was alone and friendless. He did not know what to do, but concluded he had better try to follow and find his uncle. He went down to the steamboat landing, learned that the trifle of money in his pocket would not carry him to Boston. However, it would carry him to New London. So he took passage for that port, resolving to trust to Providence to furnish him means to travel the rest of the way. He had now been wandering about the streets of New London 3 days and nights, getting a bite and a nap here and there for charity's sake. But he had given up at last. Courage and hope were both gone. If he could enlist, nobody could be more thankful. If he could not get in as a soldier, couldn't he be a drummer boy? Ah, he would work so hard to please, and would be so grateful. Well, there's the history of young Wicklow, just as he told it to me, barring details. I said, "My boy, you're among friends now. Don't you be troubled any more." How his eyes glistened! I called in Sergeant John Rayburn, he was from Hartford, lives in Hartford yet, maybe you know him, and said, "Rayburn, quarter this boy with the musicians. I am going to enroll him as a drummer boy, and I want you to look after him and see that he is well treated." Well, of course, intercourse between the commandant of the post and the drummer boy came to an end now, but the poor little friendless chap lay heavy on my heart just the same. I kept on the lookout, hoping to see him brighten up and begin to be cheery and gay, but no, the days went by and there was no change. He associated with nobody. He was always absent-minded, always thinking. His face was always sad. One morning Rayburn asked leave to speak to me privately. Said he, "I hope I don't offend, sir, but the truth is, the musicians are in such a sweat it seems as if somebody's got to speak." "Why, what is the trouble?" "It's the Wicklow boy, sir. The musicians are down on him to an extent you can't imagine." "Well, go on, go on. What has he been doing?" "Praying, sir." "Praying?" "Yes, sir. The musicians haven't any peace of their life, for the boy's prayin'. First thing in the morning he's at it, noons he's at it, and nights, well, nights he just lays on to 'em like all possessed. Sleep? Bless you, they can't sleep. He's got the floor, as the saying is, and then when he once gets his supplication mill a-going, there just simply ain't any let-up to him. He starts in with the bandmaster and he prays for him. Next he takes the head bugler and he prays for him. Next the bass drum and he scoops him in, and so on, right straight through the band, giving them all a show, and taking that amount of interest in it which would make you think he thought he weren't but a little while for this world, and believed he couldn't be happy in heaven without he had a brass band along and wanted to pick 'em out for himself, so he could depend on 'em to do up the national tunes in a style suitin' to the place. Well, sir, heaving boots at him don't have no effect. It's dark in there, and besides, he don't pray fair, anyway, but kneels down behind the big drum, so it don't make no difference if they rain boots at him. He don't give a dern. Warbles right along, same as if it was applause. They sing out, 'Oh, dry up! Give us a rest! Shoot him! Oh, take a walk!' and all sorts of such things. But what of it? It don't faze him. He don't mind it." After a pause, "Kind of a good little fool, too. Gets up in the morning and carts all the stock of boots back and sorts 'em out and sets each man's pair where they belong, and they've been throwed at him so much now that he knows every boot in the band, can sort 'em out with his eyes shut." After another pause, which I forbore to interrupt, "But the roughest thing about it is that when he's done praying, when he ever does get done, he pipes up and begins to sing. Well, you know what a honey kind of a voice he's got when he talks. You know how it would persuade a cast-iron dog to come down off a doorstep and lick his hand. Now, if you'll take my word for it, sir, it ain't the circumstance to his singing. Flute music is harsh to that boy's singing. Oh, he just gurgles it out so soft and sweet and low, there in the dark, that it makes you think you are in heaven." "What is there rough about that?" "Ah, that's just it, sir. You hear him saying, 'Just as I am, poor wretched blind,' and just you hear him sing that once, and see if you don't melt all up and the water come into your eyes. I don't care what he sings, it goes plumb straight home to you. It goes deep down to where you live, and it fetches you every time. And just you hear him sing, 'Child of sin and sorrow, filled with dismay, Wait not till tomorrow, yield thee today. Grieve not that love which from above, and so on. It makes a body feel like the wickedest, ungratefullest brute that walks. And when he sings them songs of his about home and mother and childhood and old memories and things that's vanished and old friends dead and gone, it fetches everything before your face that you ever lost in all of your life. And it's just beautiful. It's just divine to listen to, sir. But, Lord, Lord, the heartbreak of it. The band, well, they all cry. Every rascal of them blubbers, and don't try to hide it either. And first you know, that very gang that's been slamming boots at that boy will skip out of their bunks all of a sudden and rush over in the dark and hug him. Yes, they do, and slobber all over him and call him pet names and beg him to forgive them. And just at that time, if a regiment was to offer to hurt a hair of that cub's head, they'd go for that regiment if it was a whole army corps. Another pause. "Is that all?" said I. "Yes, sir." "Well, dear me, what is the complaint? What do they want done?" "Done? Why, bless you, sir, they want you to stop him from singing." "What an idea! You said his music was divine." "That's just it. It's too divine. Mortal man can't stand it. It stirs a body up so. It turns a body inside out. It racks his feelin's all to rags. It makes him feel bad and wicked and not fit for any place but perdition. It keeps a body in such an everlasting state of repentin' that nothing don't taste good and there ain't no comfort in life. And then, the cryin', you see, every mornin' they're ashamed to look one another in the face." "Well, this is an odd case and a singular complaint. So they really want the singing stopped?" "Yes, sir, that is the idea. They don't wish to ask too much. They would like powerful well to have the prayin' shut down on, or leastways trimmed off around the edges, but the main thing's the singin'. If they can only get the singin' choked off, they think they can stand the prayin', rough as it is to be bully-ragged so much that way." I told the sergeant I would take the matter under consideration. That night I crept into the musicians' quarters and listened. The sergeant had not overstated the case. I heard the praying voice pleading in the dark. I heard the execrations of the harassed men. I heard the rain of boots whiz through the air and bang and thump around the big drum. The next thing touched me, but it amused me too. By and by, after an impressive silence, came the singing. Lord, the pathos of it, the enchantment of it. Nothing in the world was ever so sweet, so gracious, so tender, so holy, so moving. I made my stay very brief. I was beginning to experience emotions of a sort not proper to the commandant of a fortress. Next day I issued orders which stopped the praying and singing. Then followed 3 or 4 days which were so full of bounty-jumping excitements and irritations that I never once thought of my drummer boy. But now comes Sergeant Rayburn one morning and says, "That new boy acts mighty strange, sir." "How?" "Well, sir, he's all the time writing." "Writing? What does he write? Letters?" "I don't know, sir, but whenever he's off duty he's poking and nosing around the fort all by himself. Blest if I can think there's a hole or corner in it he hasn't been into, and every little while he outs with pencil and paper and scribbles something down." This gave me a most unpleasant sensation. I wanted to scoff at it, but it was not a time to scoff at anything that had the least suspicious tinge about it. Things were happening all around us in the North then that warned us to be always on the alert and always suspecting. I recalled to mind the suggestive fact that this boy was from the South, the extreme South, Louisiana, and the thought was not of a reassuring nature under the circumstances. Nevertheless, it cost me a pang to give the orders which I now gave to Rayburn. I felt like a father who plots to expose his own child to shame and injury. I told Rayburn to keep quiet, bide his time, and get me some of those writings whenever he could manage it without the boy's finding it out, and I charged him not to do anything which might let the boy discover that he was being watched. I also ordered that he allow the lad his usual liberties, but that he be followed at a distance when he went out into the town. During the next 2 days Rayburn reported to me several times. No success. The boy was still writing, but he always pocketed his paper with a careless air whenever Rayburn appeared in his vicinity. He had gone twice to an old deserted stable in the town, remained a minute or two, and come out again. One could not pooh-pooh these things, they had an evil look. I was obliged to confess to myself that I was getting uneasy. I went into my private quarters and sent for my second-in-command, an officer of intelligence and judgment, son of General James Watson Webb. He was surprised and troubled. We had a long talk over the matter and came to the conclusion that it would be worth while to institute a secret search. I determined to take charge of that myself. So I had myself called at 2 in the morning, and pretty soon after I was in the musicians' quarters, crawling along the floor on my stomach among the snorers. I reached my slumbering waif's bunk at last without disturbing anybody, captured his clothes and kit, and crawled stealthily back again. When I got to my own quarters I found Webb there, waiting and eager to know the result. We made search immediately. The clothes were a disappointment. In the pockets we found blank paper and pencil, nothing else, except a jackknife and such queer odds and ends and useless trifles as boys hoard and value. We turned to the kit hopefully. Nothing there but a rebuke for us. A little Bible with this written on the fly-leaf: "Stranger, be kind to my boy for his mother's sake." I looked at Webb. He dropped his eyes. He looked at me. I dropped mine. Neither spoke. I put the book reverently back in its place. Presently Webb got up and went away without remark. After a little I nerved myself up to my unpalatable job and took the plunder back to where it belonged, crawling on my stomach as before. It seemed the peculiarly appropriate attitude for the business I was in. I was most honestly glad when it was over and done with. About noon the next day Rayburn came, as usual, to report. I cut him short. I said, "Let this nonsense be dropped. We are making a bugaboo out of a poor little cub who has got no more harm in him than a hymn book." The sergeant looked surprised and said, "Well, you know it was your orders, sir, and I've got some of the writing." "And what does it amount to? How did you get it?" "I peeped through the keyhole and see him writing, so when I judged he was about done, I made a sort of a little cough, and I see him crumple it up and throw it in the fire, and look all around to see if anybody was coming. Then he settled back as comfortable and careless as anything. Then I comes in and passes the time of day pleasantly and sends him on an errand. He never looked uneasy, but went right along. It was a coal fire and new built. The writing had gone over behind a chunk, out of sight. But I got it out, and there it is. It ain't hardly scorched, you see." I glanced at the paper and took in a sentence or two. Then I dismissed the sergeant and told him to send Webb to me. Here is the paper in full. "Fort Trumbull, the 8th. Colonel, I was mistaken as to the caliber of the 3 guns I ended my list with. They are 18-pounders. All the rest of the armament is as I stated. The garrison remains as before reported, except that the 2 light infantry companies that were to be detached for service at the front are to stay here for the present. Can't find out for how long just now, but will soon. We are satisfied that all things considered, matters had better be postponed on—" There it broke off. There is where Rayburn coughed and interrupted the writer. All my affection for the boy, all my respect for him and charity for his forlorn condition, withered in a moment under the blight of this revelation of cold-blooded baseness. But never mind about that. Here was business. Business that required profound and immediate attention, too. Webb and I turned the subject over and over and examined it all around. Webb said, "What a pity he was interrupted. Something is going to be postponed until—when? And what is the something? Possibly he would have mentioned it, the pious little reptile." "Yes," I said, "we have missed a trick. And who is 'we' in the letter? Is it conspirators inside the fort or outside?" "That "we" was uncomfortably suggestive. However, it was not worth while to be guessing around that, so we proceeded to matters more practical. In the first place we decided to double the sentries and keep the strictest possible watch. Next we thought of calling Wicklow in and making him divulge everything. But that did not seem wisest until other methods should fail. We must have some more of the writings, so we began to plan to that end, and now we had an idea. Wicklow never went to the post office. Perhaps the deserted stable was his post office. We sent for my confidential clerk, a young German named Stern, who was a sort of natural detective, and told him all about the case, and ordered him to go to work on it. Within the hour we got word that Wicklow was writing again. Shortly afterward, word came that he had asked to leave to go out into the town. He was detained a while, and meantime Stern hurried off and concealed himself in the stable. By and by he saw Wicklow saunter in, look about him, then hide something under some rubbish in a corner, and take leisurely leave again. Stern pounced upon the hidden article, a letter, and brought it to us. It had no superscription and no signature. It repeated what we had already read, and then went on to say, "We think it best to postpone till the 2 companies are gone. I mean, the 4 inside think so. Have not communicated with the others, afraid of attracting attention. I say 4 because we have lost 2. They had hardly enlisted and got inside when they were shipped off to the front. It will be absolutely necessary to have 2 in their places. The 2 that went were the brothers from 30 Mile Point. I have something of the greatest importance to reveal, but must not trust it to this method of communication. We'll try the other." "The little scoundrel," said Webb. "Who could have supposed he was a spy? However, never mind about that. Let us add up our particulars, such as they are, and see how the case stands to date. First, we've got a rebel spy in our midst whom we know. Secondly, we've got 3 more in our midst whom we don't know. Thirdly, these spies have been introduced among us through the simple and easy process of enlisting as soldiers in the Union Army, and evidently 2 of them have got sold at it and been shipped off to the front. Fourthly, there are assistant spies outside, number indefinite. Fifthly, Wicklow has very important matter which he is afraid to communicate by the present method. We'll try the other. That is the case as it now stands. Shall we collar Wicklow and make him confess? Or shall we catch the person who removes the letters from the stable and make him tell? Or shall we keep still and find out more?" We decided upon the last course. We judged that we did not need to proceed to summary measure now, since it was evident that the conspirators were likely to wait till those 2 light infantry companies were out of the way. We fortified Stern with pretty ample powers, and told him to use his best endeavors to find out Wicklow's other method of communication. We meant to play a bold game, and to this end we proposed to keep the spies in an unsuspecting state as long as possible. So we ordered Stern to return to the stable immediately, and if he found the coast clear, to conceal Wicklow's letter where it was before, and leave it there for the conspirators to get. The night closed down without further event. It was cold and dark and sleety, with a raw wind blowing. Still I turned out of my warm bed several times during the night, and went the rounds in person to see that all was right and that every sentry was on the alert. I always found them wide awake and watchful. Evidently whispers of mysterious dangers had been floating about, and the doubling of the guards had been a kind of endorsement of those rumors. Once, toward morning, I encountered Webb breasting his way against the bitter wind, and learned then that he, also, had been the rounds several times to see that all was going right. Next day's events hurried things up somewhat. Wicklow wrote another letter. Stern preceded him to the stable and saw him deposit it, captured it as soon as Wicklow was out of the way, then slipped out and followed the little spy at a distance, with a detective in plain clothes at his own heels, for we thought it judicious to have the law's assistance handy in case of need. Wicklow went to the railroad station and waited around till the train from New York came in, then stood scanning the faces of the crowd as they poured out of the cars. Presently an aged gentleman with green goggles and a cane came limping along, stopped in Wicklow's neighborhood, and began to look about him expectantly. In an instant Wicklow darted forward, thrust an envelope into his hand, then glided away and disappeared in the throng. The next instant Sterne had snatched the letter, and as he hurried past the detective he said, "Follow the old gentleman. Don't lose sight of him." Then Sterne scurried out with the crowd and came straight to the fort. We sat with closed door and instructed the guard outside to allow no interruption. First we opened the letter captured at the stable. It read as follows: "Holy Alliance. Found in the usual gun commands from the master, left there last night, which set aside the instructions heretofore received from the subordinate quarter. Have left in the gun the usual indication that the commands reach the proper hand." Webb interrupting, "Isn't the boy under constant surveillance now?" I said yes. He had been under strict surveillance ever since the capturing of his former letter. Then how could he put anything into a gun, or take anything out of it, and not get caught? "Well," I said, "I don't like the look of that very well." "I don't either," said Webb. "It simply means that there are conspirators among the very sentinels. Without their connivance in some way or other, the thing couldn't have been done." I sent for Rayburn and ordered him to examine the batteries and see what he could find. The reading of the letter was then resumed. "The new commands are peremptory, and require that the MMMM shall be FFFFF at 3 o'clock tomorrow morning. 200 will arrive, in small parties, by train and otherwise, from various directions, and will be at appointed place at right time. I will distribute the sign to-day. Success is apparently sure, though something must have got out, for the sentries have been doubled and the chiefs went the rounds last night several times. W. comes from Southerly to-day, and will receive secret orders by the other method. All 6 of you must be in 166 at sharp 2 a.m. You will find E.B. there, who will give you detailed instructions. Password same as last time, only reversed. Put first syllable last and last syllable first. Remember XXXX. Do not forget. Be of good heart. Before the next sun rises, you will be heroes. Your fame will be permanent. You will have added a deathless page to history. Amen." "Thunder and Mars," said Webb, "but we are getting into mighty hot quarters as I look at it." I said there was no question but that things were beginning to wear a most serious aspect. Said I, "A desperate enterprise is on foot, that is plain enough. Tonight is the time set for. That also is plain. The exact nature of the enterprise, I mean the manner of it, is hidden away under those blind bunches of M's and F's, but the end and aim, I judge, is the surprise and capture of the post. We must move quick and sharp now. I think nothing can be gained by continuing our clandestine policy as regards Wicklow. We must know, and as soon as possible, too, where 166 is located, so that we can make a descent upon the gang there at 2 a.m., and doubtless the quickest way to get that information will be to force it out of that boy. But first of all, and before we make any important move, I must lay the facts before the War Department and ask for plenary powers." The despatch was prepared in cipher to go over the wires. I read it, approved it, and sent it along. We presently finished discussing the letter which was under consideration, and then opened the one which had been snatched from the lame gentleman. It contained nothing but a couple of perfectly blank sheets of note paper. It was a chilly check to our hot eagerness and expectancy. We felt as blank as the paper for a moment, and twice as foolish. But it was for a moment only, for, of course, we immediately afterward thought of sympathetic ink. We held the paper close to the fire and watched for the characters to come out under the influence of the heat, but nothing appeared but some faint tracings, which we could make nothing of. We then called in the surgeon, and sent him off with orders to apply every test he was acquainted with till he got the right one, and report the contents of the letter to me the instant he brought them to the surface. This check was a confounded annoyance, and we naturally chafed under the delay. for we had fully expected to get out of that letter some of the most important secrets of the plot. Now appeared Sergeant Rayburn and drew from his pocket a piece of twine string about a foot long, with 3 knots tied in it, and held it up. "I got it out of a gun on the waterfront," said he. "I took the tompions out of all the guns and examined close. This string was the only thing that was in any gun." So this bit of string was Wicklow's sign to signify that the master's commands had not miscarried. I ordered that every sentinel who had served near that gun during the past 24 hours be put in confinement at once, and separately, and not allowed to communicate with anyone without my privity and consent. A telegram now came from the Secretary of War. It read as follows: "Suspend habeas corpus. Put town under martial law. Make necessary arrests. Act with vigor and promptness. Keep the department informed." We were now in a shape to go to work. I sent out and had the lame gentleman quietly arrested and as quickly brought into the fort. I placed him under arrest and forbade speech to him or from him. He was inclined to bluster at first, but he soon dropped that. Next came word that Wicklow had been seen to give something to a couple of our new recruits, and that, as soon as his back was turned, these had been seized and confined. Upon each was found a small bit of paper, bearing these words and signs in pencil: "Eagle's third flight. Remember XXXX. 166." End of Part 1 of A Curious Experience by Mark Twain. This is Section 2 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2, A Curious Experience, Section 2, read by John Greenman. In accordance with instructions, I telegraphed to the department, in cipher, the progress made, and also described the above ticket. We seemed to be in a strong enough position now to venture to throw off the mask as regarded Wicklow, so I sent for him. I also sent for and received back the letter written in sympathetic ink, the surgeon accompanying it with the information that thus far it had resisted his tests, but that there were others he could apply when I should be ready for him to do so. Presently Wicklow entered. He had a somewhat worn and anxious look, but he was composed and easy, and if he suspected anything it did not appear in his face or manner. I allowed him to stand there a moment or two, then I said pleasantly, "My boy, why do you go to that old stable so much?" He answered, with simple demeanor and without embarrassment, "Well, I hardly know, sir. There isn't any particular reason, except that I like to be alone, and I amuse myself there." "You amuse yourself there, do you?" "Yes, sir," he replied, as innocently and simply as before. "Is that all you do there?" "Yes, sir," he said, looking up with childlike wonderment in his big soft eyes. "You are sure?" "Yes, sir, sure." After a pause I said, "Wicklow, why do you write so much?" "I do not write much, sir." "You don't?" "No, sir. Oh, if you mean scribbling, I do scribble some, for amusement." "What do you do with your scribblings?" "Nothing, sir. Throw them away." "Never send them to anybody?" "No, sir." I suddenly thrust before him the letter to the Colonel. He started slightly, but immediately composed himself. A slight tinge spread itself over his cheek. "How came you to send this piece of scribbling, then?" "I never meant any harm, sir." "Never meant any harm. You betray the armament and condition of the post, and mean no harm by it?" He hung his head and was silent. "Come, speak up and stop lying. Whom was this letter intended for?" He showed signs of distress now. but quickly collected himself and replied, in a tone of deep earnestness, "I will tell you the truth, sir, the whole truth. The letter was never intended for anybody at all. I wrote it only to amuse myself. I see the error and foolishness of it now, but it is the only offense, sir, upon my honor." "Ah, I am glad of that. It is dangerous to be writing such letters. I hope you are sure this is the only one you wrote." "Yes, sir, perfectly sure." His hardihood was stupefying. He told that lie with as sincere a countenance as any creature ever wore. I waited a moment to soothe down my rising temper, and then said, "Wicklow, jog your memory, now, and see if you can help me with 2 or 3 little matters which I wish to inquire about." "I will do my very best, sir." "Then, to begin with, who is the master?" It betrayed him into darting a startled glance at our faces, but that was all. He was serene again in a moment, and tranquilly answered, "I do not know, sir." "You do not know?" "I do not know." "You are sure you do not know?" He tried hard to keep his eyes on mine, but the strain was too great. His chin sunk slowly towards his breast, and he was silent. He stood there nervously fumbling with a button, an object to command one's pity in spite of his base acts. Presently I broke the stillness with a question, "Who are the Holy Alliance?" His body shook visibly, and he made a slight random gesture with his hands, which to me was like the appeal of a despairing creature for compassion. But he made no sound. He continued to stand with his face bent toward the ground. As we sat gazing at him, waiting for him to speak, we saw the big tears begin to roll down his cheeks, but he remained silent. After a little I said, "You must answer me, my boy, and you must tell me the truth. Who are the Holy Alliance?" He wept on in silence. Presently I said, somewhat sharply, "Answer that question." He struggled to get command of his voice, and then, looking up appealingly, forced the words out between his sobs. "Oh, have pity on me, sir. I cannot answer it, for I do not know." "What?" "Indeed, sir, I am telling the truth. I never have heard of the Holy Alliance till this moment. On my honor, sir, this is so." "Good heavens! Look at this second letter of yours there. Do you see those words, Holy Alliance? What do you say now?" He gazed up into my face with the hurt look of one upon whom a great wrong has been wrought, then said feelingly, "This is some cruel joke, sir, and how could they play it upon me, who have tried all I could to do right, and have never done harm to anybody? Someone has counterfeited my hand. I never wrote a line of this. I have never seen this letter before." "Oh, you unspeakable liar! Here, what do you say to this?" And I snatched the sympathetic ink letter from my pocket and thrust it before his eyes. His face turned white as a dead person's. He wavered slightly in his tracks and put his hand against the wall to steady himself. After a moment he asked, in so faint a voice that it was hardly audible, "Have you read it?" Our faces must have answered the truth before my lips could get out the false "yes," for I distinctly saw the courage come back into that boy's eyes. I waited for him to say something, but he kept silent. So at last I said, "Well, what have you to say as to the revelations in this letter?" He answered with perfect composure, "Nothing, except that they are entirely harmless and innocent. They can hurt nobody." I was in something of a corner now. As I couldn't disprove his assertion, I did not exactly know how to proceed. However, an idea came to my relief, and I said, "You are sure you know nothing about the Master and the Holy Alliance, and did not write the letter which you say is a forgery?" "Yes, sir, sure." I slowly drew out the knotted twine string and held it up without speaking. He gazed at it indifferently, then looked at me inquiringly. My patience was sorely taxed. However, I kept my temper down and said in my usual voice, "Wicklow, do you see this?" "Yes, sir." "What is it?" "It seems to be a piece of string." "Seems. It is a piece of string. Do you recognize it?" "No, sir," he replied, as calmly as the words could be uttered. His coolness was perfectly wonderful. I paused now for several seconds, in order that the silence might add impressiveness to what I was about to say. Then I rose and laid my hand on his shoulder, and said gravely, "It will do you no good, poor boy, none in the world. This sign to the master, this knotted string found in one of the guns on the waterfront—" "Found in the gun? Oh, no, 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 do not say in the gun, but in a crack in the tompion. It must have been in the crack." And down he went on his knees and clasped his hands and lifted up a face that was pitiful to see, so ashy it was, and so wild with terror. "No, it was in the gun." "Oh, something has gone wrong. My God, I am lost!" And he sprung up and darted this way and that, dodging the hands that were put out to catch him, and doing his best to escape from the place. But of course escape was impossible. Then he flung himself on his knees again, crying with all his might, and clasped me around the legs. And so he clung to me and begged and pleaded, saying, "Oh, have pity on me! Oh, be merciful to me! Do not betray me! They would not spare my life for a moment! Protect me! Save me! I will confess everything!" It took us some time to quiet him down and modify his fright, and get him into something like a rational frame of mind. Then I began to question him, he answering humbly with downcast eyes, and from time to time swabbing away his constantly flowing tears. "So, you are at heart a rebel?" "Yes, sir." "And a spy?" "Yes, sir." "And have been acting under distinct orders from outside?" "Yes, sir." "Willingly?" "Yes, sir." "Gladly, perhaps?" "Yes, sir, it would do no good to deny it. The South is my country, my heart is Southern, and it is all in her cause." "Then the tale you told me of your wrongs and the persecution of your family was made up for the occasion?" They told me to say it, sir." "And you would betray and destroy those who pitied and sheltered you. Do you comprehend how base you are, you poor, misguided thing?" He replied with sobs only. "Well, let that pass. To business. Who is the Colonel, and where is he?" He began to cry hard, and tried to beg off from answering. He said he would be killed if he told. I threatened to put him in the dark cell and lock him up if he did not come out with the information. At the same time I promised to protect him from all harm if he made a clean breast. For all answer he closed his mouth firmly, and put on a stubborn air which I could not bring him out of. At last I started with him. But a single glance into the dark cell converted him. He broke into a passion of weeping and supplicating, and declared he would tell everything. So I brought him back, and he named the Colonel and described him particularly. Said he would be found at the principal hotel in the town in citizen's dress. I had to threaten him again before he would describe and name the master. Said the master would be found at No. 15 Bond Street, New York, passing under the name of R. F. Gaylord. I telegraphed name and description to the chief of police of the metropolis, and asked that Gaylord be arrested and held till I could send for him. "Now," said I, "it seems that there are several of the conspirators outside, presumably in New London. Name and describe them." He named and described 3 men and 2 women, all stopping at the principal hotel. I sent out quietly and had them and the Colonel arrested and confined in the fort. "Next, I want to know all about your 3 fellow conspirators who are here in the fort." He was about to dodge me with a falsehood, I thought, but I produced the mysterious bits of paper which had been found on 2 of them, and this had a salutary effect upon him. I said we had possession of 2 of the men, but he must point out the 3rd. This frightened him badly, and he cried out, "Oh, please don't make me! He would kill me on the spot!" I said that that was all nonsense. I would have somebody near by to protect him, and besides, the men should be assembled without arms. I ordered all the raw recruits to be mustered, and then the poor trembling little wretch went out and stepped along down the line, trying to look as indifferent as possible. Finally he spoke a single word to one of the men, and before he had gone 5 steps the man was under arrest. As soon as Wicklow was with us again, I had those 3 men brought in. I made one of them stand forward and said, "Now, Wicklow, mind, not a shade's divergence from the exact truth. Who is this man, and what do you know about him?" Being in for it, he cast consequences aside, fastened his eyes on the man's face, and spoke straight along without hesitation to the following effect. "His real name is George Bristow. He is from New Orleans. Was second mate of the Coast Packet Capital 2 years ago. Is a desperate character, and has served 2 terms for manslaughter, one for killing a deckhand named Hyde with a capstan bar, and one for killing a roustabout for refusing to heave the lead, which is no part of a roustabout's business. He is a spy, and was sent here by the Colonel to act in that capacity. He was 3rd mate of the St. Nicholas when she blew up in the neighborhood of Memphis in '58, and came near being lynched for robbing the dead and wounded while they were being taken ashore in an empty wood boat." And so forth and so on. He gave the man's biography in full. When he had finished, I said to the man, "What have you to say to this?" "Barring your presence, sir, it is the infernalest lie that ever was spoke." I sent him back into confinement and called the others forward in turn. Same result. The boy gave a detailed history of each, without hesitating for a word or a fact, but all I could get out of either rascal was the indignant assertion that it was all a lie. They would confess nothing. I returned them to captivity, and brought out the rest of my prisoners one by one. Wicklow told all about them, what towns in the South they came from, and every detail of their connection with the conspiracy. But they all denied his facts, and not one of them confessed a thing. The men raged, the women cried. According to their stories, they were all innocent people from out West, and loved the Union above all things in this world. I locked the gang up in disgust and fell to catechizing Wicklow once more. "Where is number 166, and who is B.B.?" But there he was determined to draw the line. Neither coaxing nor threats had any effect upon him. Time was flying. It was necessary to institute sharp measures, so I tied him up a tiptoe by the thumbs. As the pain increased, it wrung screams from him which were almost more than I could bear. But I held my ground, and pretty soon he shrieked out, "Oh, please, let me down, I will tell." "No, you'll tell before I let you down." Every instant was agony to him now, so out it came. "Number 166, Eagle Hotel," naming a wretched tavern down by the water, a resort of common laborers, longshoremen, and less reputable folk. So I released him, and then demanded to know the object of the conspiracy. "To take the fort tonight," said he, doggedly and sobbing. "Have I got all the chiefs of the conspiracy?" "No, you've got all except those that are to meet at 166. "What does remember XXXX mean?" No reply. "What is the password for number 166? No reply. "What do those bunches of letters mean, FFFFF and MMMM? Answer, or you will catch it again." "I never will answer. I will die first. Now do what you please." "Think what you are saying, Wicklow. Is it final?" He answered steadily, and without a quiver in his voice, "It is final, and as sure as I love my wronged country and hate everything this northern sun shines on, I will die before I will reveal those things." I triced him up by the thumbs again. When the agony was full upon him, It was heartbreaking to hear the poor thing's shrieks, but we got nothing else out of him. To every question he screamed the same reply: "I can die, and I will die, but I will never tell." Well, we had to give it up. We were convinced that he certainly would die rather than confess. So we took him down and imprisoned him under strict guard. Then for some hours we busied ourselves with sending telegrams to the War Department, and with making preparations for a descent upon number 166. It was stirring times, that black and bitter night. Things had leaked out, and the whole garrison was on the alert. The sentinels were trebled, and nobody could move, outside or in, without being brought to a stand with a musket leveled at his head. However, Webb and I were less concerned now than we had previously been, because of the fact that the conspiracy must necessarily be in a pretty crippled condition, since so many of its principles were in our clutches. I determined to be at number 166 in good season, capture and gag BB, and be on hand for the rest when they arrived. At about 1:15 in the morning I crept out of the fortress with half a dozen stalwart and gamey U.S. regulars at my heels, and the boy Wicklow with his hands tied behind him. I told him we were going to 166, and that if I found he had lied again and was misleading us, he would have to show us the right place or suffer the consequences. We approached the tavern stealthily and reconnoitered. A light was burning in the small bar-room. The rest of the house was dark. I tried the front door. It yielded, and we softly entered, closing the door behind us. Then we removed our shoes, and I led the way to the bar-room. The German landlord sat there asleep in his chair. I woke him gently and told him to take off his boots and precede us, warning him at the same time to utter no sound. He obeyed without a murmur, but evidently he was badly frightened. I ordered him to lead the way to 166. We ascended 2 or 3 flights of stairs as softly as a file of cats, and then, having arrived near the farther end of a long hall, we came to a door through the glazed transom of which we could discern the glow of a dim light from within. The landlord felt for me in the dark and whispered me that that was 166. I tried the door. It was locked on the inside. I whispered an order to one of my biggest soldiers. We set our ample shoulders to the door, and with one heave we burst it from its hinges. I caught a half glimpse of a figure in a bed, saw its head dart toward the candle. Out went the light, and we were in pitch darkness. With one big bound I lit on that bed and pinned its occupant down with my knees. My prisoner struggled fiercely, but I got a grip on his throat with my left hand, and that was a good assistance to my knees in holding him down. Then I snatched out my revolver, cocked it, and laid the cold barrel warningly against his cheek. "Now, somebody strike a light," said I. "I've got him safe." It was done. The flame of the match burst up. I looked at my captive, and by George it was a young woman. I let go and got off the bed, feeling pretty sheepish. Everybody stared stupidly at his neighbor. Nobody had any wit or sense left, so sudden and overwhelming had been the surprise. The young woman began to cry, and covered her face with the sheet. The landlord said meekly, "My daughter, she has been doing something that is not right, nicht wahr?" "Your daughter? Is she your daughter?" "Oh, yes, she is my daughter. She is just tonight come home from Cincinnati a little bit sick." "Confound it, that boy has lied again. This is not the right 166. This is not BB. Now, Wicklow, you will find the correct 166 for us, or— Hello, where is that boy?" Gone, as sure as guns. And what is more, we failed to find a trace of him. Here was an awkward predicament. I cursed my stupidity in not tying him to one of the men, but it was no use to bother about that now. What should I do under the present circumstances? That was the question. That girl might be BB after all. I did not believe it, but it still would not answer to take unbelief for proof. So I finally put my men in a vacant room across the hall from 166 and told them to capture anybody and everybody that approached the girl's room, and to keep the landlord with them and under strict watch until further orders. Then I hurried back to the fort to see if all was right there yet. Yes, all was right, and all remained right. I stayed up all night to make sure of that. Nothing happened. I was unspeakably glad to see the dawn come again, and be able to telegraph the department that the Stars and Stripes still floated over Fort Trumbull. An immense pressure was lifted from my breast. Still, I did not relax vigilance, of course, nor effort either. The case was too grave for that. I had up my prisoners, one by one, and harried them by the hour, trying to get them to confess. But it was a failure. They only gnashed their teeth and tore their hair and revealed nothing. About noon came tidings of my missing boy. He had been seen on the road tramping westward, some 8 miles out, at 6 in the morning. I started a cavalry lieutenant and a private on his track at once. They came in sight of him 20 miles out. He had climbed a fence and was wearily dragging himself across a slushy field toward a large old-fashioned mansion in the edge of a village. They rode through a bit of woods, made a detour, and closed up on the house from the opposite side, then dismounted and scurried into the kitchen. Nobody there. They slipped into the next room, which was also unoccupied. The door from that room into the front, or sitting room, was open. They were about to step through it when they heard a low voice. It was somebody praying. So they halted reverently, and the lieutenant put his head in and saw an old man and an old woman kneeling in a corner of that sitting-room. It was the old man that was praying, and just as he was finishing his prayer, the Wicklow boy opened the front door and stepped in. Both of those people sprang at him, smothering him with embraces, shouting, "Our boy! Our darling! God be praised! The lost is found! He that was dead is alive again!" Well, sir, what do you think? That young imp was born and reared on that homestead, and had never been 5 miles away from it in all his life, till the fortnight before he loafed into my quarters and gulled me with that maudlin yarn of his. It's as true as gospel. That old man was his father, a learned old retired clergyman, and that old lady was his mother. Let me throw in a word or two of explanation concerning that boy and his performances. It turned out that he was a ravenous devourer of dime novels and sensational story papers. Therefore, dark, mysterious, and gaudy heroisms were just in his line. Then he had read newspaper reports of the stealthy goings and comings of rebel spies in our midst, and of their lurid purposes and their 2 or 3 startling achievements, till his imagination was all aflame on that subject. His constant comrade for some months had been a Yankee youth of much tongue and lively fancy, who had served for a couple of years as mud clerk, that is, subordinate purser, on certain of the packet boats plying between New Orleans and points 200 or 300 miles up the Mississippi. Hence his easy faculty in handling the names and other details pertaining to that region. Now, I had spent 2 or 3 months in that part of the country before the war, and I knew just enough about it to be easily taken in by that boy, whereas a born Louisianian would probably have caught him tripping before he had talked 15 minutes. Do you know the reason he said he would rather die than explain certain of his treasonable enigmas? Simply because he couldn't explain them. They had no meaning. He had fired them out of his imagination without forethought or afterthought, and so, upon sudden call, he wasn't able to invent an explanation of them. For instance, he couldn't reveal what was hidden in the sympathetic ink letter, for the ample reason that there wasn't anything hidden in it. It was blank paper only. He hadn't put anything into a gun, and had never intended to, for his letters were all written to imaginary persons. When he hid one in the stable, he always removed the one he had put there the day before, so he was not acquainted with that knotted string, since he was seeing it for the first time when I showed it to him. But as soon as I had let him find out where it came from, he straightway adopted it in his romantic fashion, and got some fine effects out of it. He invented Mr. Gaylord. There wasn't any 15 Bond Street just then. It had been pulled down 3 months before. He invented the Colonel. He invented the glib histories of those unfortunates whom I captured and confronted with him. He invented BB. He invented number 166, one may say, for we didn't know there was such a number in the Eagle Hotel until we went there. He stood there ready to invent anybody or anything whenever it was wanted. If I called for outside spies, he promptly described strangers whom he had seen at the hotel, and whose names he had happened to hear. He lived in a gorgeous, mysterious, romantic world during those few stirring days, and I think it was real to him, and that he enjoyed it clear down to the bottom of his heart. But he made trouble enough for us, and just no end of humiliation. You see, on account of him we had 15 or 20 people under arrest and confinement in the fort, with sentinels before their door. A lot of the captives were soldiers and such, and to them I didn't have to apologize, but the rest were first-class citizens from all over the country, and no amount of apologies were sufficient to satisfy them. They just fumed and raged and made no end of trouble. And those 2 ladies, one was an Ohio congressman's wife, the other a Western bishop's sister. Well, the scorn and ridicule and angry tears they poured out on me made up a keepsake that was likely to make me remember them for a considerable time, and I shall. That old lame gentleman with the goggles was a college president from Philadelphia, who had come up to attend his nephew's funeral. He had never seen young Wicklow before, of course. Well, he had not only missed the funeral and got jailed as a rebel spy, but Wicklow had stood up there in my quarters and coldly described him as a counterfeiter, nigger trader, horse thief, and a firebug from the most notorious rascal nest in Galveston. And this was a thing which that poor old gentleman couldn't seem to get over at all. And the War Department! But, oh my soul, let's draw the curtains over that part. Note: I showed my manuscript to the Major, and he said, "Your unfamiliarity with military matters has betrayed you into some little mistakes. Still, they are picturesque ones. Let them go. Military men will smile at them. The rest won't detect them. You have got the main facts of the history right, and have set them down just about as they occurred." M.T. End of A Curious Experience by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. This is Section 3 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. The Heart of a Humorist, by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. The following extracts are from a letter to the Secretary of the London Anti-Vivisection Society. Dear Sir, I believe I am not interested to know whether vivisection produces results that are profitable to the human race or doesn't. To know that the results are profitable to the race would not remove my hostility to it. The pains which it inflicts upon unconsenting animals is the basis of my enmity toward it, and it is to me sufficient justification of the enmity without looking further. It is so distinctly a matter of feeling with me, and is so strong and deep-rooted in my make and constitution, that I am sure I could not even see a vivisector vivisected with anything more than a sort of qualified satisfaction. I do not say I should not go and look on. I only mean that I should almost surely fail to get out of it the degree of contentment which it ought, of course, to be expected to furnish. I have tried to understand why it should be considered a kind of credit and a handsome thing to belong to a human race that has vivisectors in it, and I have also tried to imagine what would become of the race if it had to be saved by my practicing vivisection on the French plan. Let me quote. Vivisectors possess a drug called curare, which, given to an animal, effectually prevents any struggle or cry. A horrible feature of curare is that it has no anesthetic effect, but, on the contrary, it intensifies the sensibility to pain. The animal is perfectly conscious, suffers doubly, and is able to make no sign. I am not desirous of shocking you by reciting the atrocities of vivisection, but since the apologists try to deceive the public by vague statements that vivisectors would not and do not perpetrate cruelty, I wish to say sufficient to disprove their assertions. Professor Brooke says, Lectures on Physiology, Volume 2, page 76, the first sign that the trigeminus is divided is a loud piercing shriek from the animal. Rabbits, we know, are not very sensitive, but in this operation they invariably send forth a prolonged shriek. I could quote still more shameful vivisection records from this paper, but I lack the stomach for it. Very truly yours, Mark Twain. End of The Heart of a Humorist by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. This is Section 4 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2, by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. How Tom Sawyer Got His Fence Whitewashed. Read by John Greenman. Tom Sawyer, having offended his sole guardian, Aunt Polly, is by that sternly affectionate dame punished by being set to whitewash the fence in front of the garden. The world seemed a hollow mockery to Tom, who had planned fun for that day, and he knew that he would be the laughing-stock of all the boys as they came past and saw him set to work like a nigger. But a great inspiration burst upon him, and he went tranquilly to work. What that inspiration was will appear from what follows. One of the boys, Ben Rogers, comes by and pauses, eating a particularly fine apple. Tom does not see him. Ben stared a moment and then said, "Hey, you're a stump, ain't you?" No answer. Tom surveyed his last touch with the eye of an artist. Then he gave another gentle sweep and surveyed the result as before. Ben ranged up alongside of him. Tom's mouth watered for the apple, but he stuck to his work. Ben said, "Hello, chap. You got to work, eh?" "Why, it's you, Ben. I wasn't noticing." "Say, I'm going in a-swimming, I am. Don't you wish you could? But of course you'd rather work, wouldn't you? Of course you would." Tom contemplated the boy a bit and said, "What do you call work?" "Why, ain't that work?" Tom resumed his whitewashing and answered carelessly, "Well, maybe it is, and maybe it ain't. All I know is it suits Tom Sawyer." "Oh, come now, you don't mean to let on that you like it?" The brush continued to move. "Like it? But I don't see why I oughtn't to like it. Does a boy get a chance to whitewash a fence every day?" That put the thing in a new light. Ben stopped nibbling his apple. Tom swept his brush daintily back and forth, stepped back to note the effect, added a touch here and there, criticized the effect again. Ben, watching every move and getting more and more interested, more and more absorbed. Presently he said, "Say, Tom, let me whitewash a little." Tom considered, was about to consent, but he altered his mind. No, I reckon it wouldn't hardly do, Ben. You see, Aunt Polly's awful particular about this fence, right here on the street, you know. But if it was the back fence I wouldn't mind, and she wouldn't. Yes, she's awful particular about this fence. It's got to be done very carefully. I reckon there ain't one boy in 1,000, maybe 2,000, that can do it in the way it's got to be done. No, is that so? Oh, come on now. Let me just try, only just a little. I'd let you if you was me, Tom. Ben, I'd like to, honest Injun, but Aunt Polly, well, Jim wanted to do it, but she wouldn't let him. Sid wanted to do it, but she wouldn't let Sid. Now, don't you see how I'm fixed? If you was to tackle this fence and anything was to happen to—
"Oh, shucks! I'll be just as careful. Now let me try.
Say, I'll give you the core of my apple." "Well, here. No, Ben. Now don't. I'm afeard I'll give you all of it." Tom gave up the brush with reluctance in his face, but alacrity in his heart. And while Ben worked and sweated in the sun, the retired artist sat on a barrel in the shade close by, dangling his legs, munched his apple, and planned the slaughter of more innocents. There was no lack of material. Boys happened along every little while. They came to jeer, but remained to whitewash. By the time Ben was fagged out, Tom had traded the next chance to Billy Fisher for a kite in good repair. And when he played out, Johnny Miller bought it for a dead rat and a string to swing it with, and so on, hour after hour. And when the middle of the afternoon came, from being a poor poverty-stricken boy in the morning, Tom was literally rolling in wealth. He had, besides the things I have mentioned, 12 marbles, part of a Jew's harp, a piece of blue bottle glass to look through, a spool cannon, a key that wouldn't unlock anything, a fragment of chalk, a glass stopper of a decanter, a tin soldier, a couple of tadpoles, 6 firecrackers, a kitten with only one eye, a brass doorknob, a dog collar, but no dog, the handle of a knife, 4 pieces of orange peel, and a dilapidated old window sash. He had had a nice, good, idle time all the while, plenty of company, and the fence had 3 coats of whitewash on it. If he hadn't run out of whitewash, he would have bankrupted every boy in the village. Tom said to himself that it was not such a hollow world after all. He had discovered a great law of human action without knowing it, namely, that in order to make a man or a boy covet a thing, it is only necessary to make it difficult to attain. Mark Twain. End of How Tom Sawyer Got His Fence Whitewashed, read by John Greenman. This is Section 5 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jim Smiley's Frog, by Mark Twain, read by John Greenman.
Well, this here Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and all of them kind of things, till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on but he'd match you. He ketched a frog one day and took him home, and said he calculated to educate him, and so he never done nothing for 3 months but set in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him, too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a doughnut. See him turn one somerset, or maybe a couple, if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right, like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies, and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything. And I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Dan'l Webster down here on this floor— Dan'l Webster was the name of the frog— and sing out, "Flies, Dan'l, flies!" And quicker'n you could wink he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off on the counter there, and flop down on the floor again, as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he had no idea he'd been doing any more'n any frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it came to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywhere all said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet.
One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, came across him with his box and says, "What might it be that you've got in the box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And then the feller took it and looked at it careful, and turned it around this way and that, and says, So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again, and took another long, particular look, and gave it back to Smiley, and says, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better'n any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only a amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and then says, kinder sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, "That's all right, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." And so the feller took the box, and put up his $40 along with Smiley's, and set down to wait. So he set there a good while, thinking and thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open, and took a teaspoon and filled him up full of quail shot. Filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he ketched a frog and fetched him in, and give him to this feller, and says, "Now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Dan'l, with his forepaws just even with Dan'l's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, "1, 2, 3, jump!" And him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off, but Dan'l gave a heave and histed up his shoulders so, like a Frenchman, but it wasn't no use, he couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as an anvil, and he couldn't no more stir than he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted, too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out at the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulders, this way, at Dan'l, and says again, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better'n any other frog." Smiley he stood scratching his head and looking down at Dan'l a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He 'pears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he ketched Dan'l by the nape of the neck and lifted him up and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pound." And turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down, and took out after that feller, but he never ketched him. End of Jim Smiley's Frog, by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. This is Section 6 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. Luck, by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. Note: this is not a fancy sketch. I got it from a clergyman who was an instructor at Woolwich 40 years ago, and who vouched for its truth. M.T. It was at a banquet in London, in honor of one of the 2 or 3 conspicuously illustrious English military names of this generation. For reasons which will presently appear, I will withhold his real name and titles, and call him Lieutenant General Lord Arthur Scoresby, Y.C., K.C.B., etc., etc., etc. What a fascination there is in a renowned name! There sat the man, in actual flesh,
whom I had heard of so many thousands of times since that day, 30 years before, when his name shot suddenly to the zenith from a Crimean battlefield, to remain forever celebrated. It was food and drink to me to look and look and look at that demigod, scanning, searching, noting the quietness, the reserve, the noble gravity of his countenance, the simple honesty that expressed itself all over him, the sweet unconsciousness of his greatness, unconsciousness of the hundreds of admiring eyes fastened upon him, unconsciousness of the deep, loving, sincere worship welling out of the breasts of those people and flowing toward him. The clergyman at my left was an old acquaintance of mine, clergyman now, but had spent the first half of his life in the camp and field, and as an instructor in the military school at Woolwich. Just at the moment I had been talking about, a veiled and singular light glimmered in his eyes, and he leaned down and muttered confidentially to me, indicating the hero of the banquet with a gesture, "Privately, his glory is an accident, just a product of incredible luck." This verdict was a great surprise to me. If its subject had been Napoleon or Socrates or Solomon, my astonishment could not have been greater. Two things I was well aware of: that the Reverend was a man of strict veracity, and that his judgment of men was good. Therefore I knew, beyond doubt or question, that the world was mistaken about this hero. He was a fool. So I meant to find out, at a convenient moment, how the Reverend, all solitary and alone, had discovered the secret. Some days later came the explanation of this strange remark, and this is what the Reverend told me. About 40 years ago I was an instructor in the military academy at Woolwich. I was present in one of the sections when young Scoresby underwent his preliminary examination. I was touched to the quick with pity, for the rest of the class answered up brightly and handsomely, while why, dear me, he didn't know anything, so to speak. He was evidently good and sweet and lovable and guileless, and so it was exceedingly painful to see him stand there, as serene as a graven image, and deliver himself of answers which were veritably miraculous for stupidity and ignorance. All the compassion in me was aroused in his behalf. I said to myself, when he comes to be examined again, he will be flung over, of course, so it will be a simple, harmless act of charity to ease his fall as much as I can. I took him aside and found that he knew a little of Caesar's history, and as he didn't know anything else, I went to work and drilled him like a galley slave on a certain line of stock questions concerning Caesar which I knew would be used. If you'll believe me, he went through with flying colors on examination day. He went through on that purely superficial cram, and got compliments too, while others, who knew 1,000 times more than he, got plucked. By some strangely lucky accident, an accident not likely to happen twice in a century, he was asked no question outside of the narrow limits of his drill. It was stupefying. Well, all through his course I stood by him with something of the sentiment which a mother feels for a crippled child, and he always saved himself, just by miracle, apparently. Now, of course, the thing that would expose him and kill him at last was mathematics. I resolved to make his death as easy as I could, so I drilled him and crammed him and drilled him, just on the line of questions which the examiner would be most likely to use, and then launched him on his fate. Well, sir, try to conceive of the result. To my consternation, he took the first prize, and with it he got a perfect ovation in the way of compliments. Sleep? There was no more sleep for me for a week. My conscience tortured me day and night. What I had done purely through charity, and only to ease the poor youth's fall. I never had dreamed of any such preposterous result as the thing that had happened. I felt as guilty and miserable as the creator of Frankenstein. Here was a woodenhead, whom I had put in the way of glittering promotions and prodigious responsibilities, and but one thing could happen. He and his responsibilities would all go to ruin together at the first opportunity. The Crimean War had just broken out. Of course there had to be a war, I said to myself. We couldn't have peace and give this donkey a chance to die before he is found out. I waited for the earthquake. It came, and it made me reel when it did come. He was actually gazetted to a captaincy in a marching regiment. Better men grow old and gray in the service before they climb to a sublimity like that. And who could ever have foreseen that they would go and put such a load of responsibility on such green and inadequate shoulders? I could just barely have stood it if they had made him a cornet. But a captain! Think of it! I thought my hair would turn white. Consider what I did, I who so loved repose and inaction. I said to myself, I am responsible to the country for this, and I must go along with him and protect the country against him as far as I can. So I took my poor little capital, that I had saved up through years of work and grinding economy, and went with a sigh and bought a cornetcy in his regiment, and away we went to the field. And there, oh dear, it was awful. Blunders? Why, he never did anything but blunder. But, you see, nobody was in the fellow's secret. Everybody had him focused wrong, and necessarily misinterpreted his performance every time. Consequently, they took his idiotic blunders for inspirations of genius. They did, honestly. His mildest blunders were enough to make a man in his right mind cry. And they did make me cry, and rage and rave, too, privately. And the thing that kept me always in a sweat of apprehension was the fact that every fresh blunder he made increased the luster of his reputation. I kept saying to myself, he'll go so high that when discovery does finally come, it will be like the sun falling out of the sky. He went right along up, from grade to grade, over the dead bodies of his superiors, until at last, in the hottest moment of the Battle of blank, down went our colonel, and my heart jumped into my mouth, for Scoresby was next in rank. "Now for it," said I. "We'll all land in shoal in 10 minutes, sure." The battle was awfully hot. The Allies were steadily giving way all over the field. Our regiment occupied a position that was vital. A blunder now must be destruction. At this critical moment, what does this immortal fool do but detach the regiment from its place and order a charge over a neighboring hill where there wasn't a suggestion of an enemy. "There you go," I said to myself. "This is the end at last." And away we did go, and were over the shoulder of the hill before the insane movement could be discovered and stopped. And what did we find? An entire and unsuspected Russian army in reserve. And what happened? We were eaten up? That is necessarily what would have happened in 99 cases out of 100, but no! Those Russians argued that no single regiment would come browsing around there at such a time. It must be the entire English army, and that the sly Russian game was detected and blocked. So they turned tail, and away they went pell-mell, over the hill and down into the field, in wild confusion, and we after them. They themselves broke the solid Russia center in the field, and tore through, and in no time there was the most tremendous rout you ever saw, and the defeat of the Allies was turned into a sweeping and splendid victory. Marshal Canrobert looked on, dizzy with astonishment, admiration, and delight, and sent right off for Scoresby, and hugged him, and decorated him on the field in presence of all the armies. And what was Scoresby's blunder that time? Merely the mistaking his right hand from his left, that was all. An order had come to him to fall back and support our right, and instead he fell forward and went over the hill to the left. But the name he won that day as a marvelous military genius filled the world with his glory, and that glory will never fade while history books last. He is just as good and sweet and lovable and unpretending as a man can be, but he doesn't know enough to come in when it rains. Now that is absolutely true. He is the supremest ass in the universe, and until half an hour ago nobody knew it but himself and me. He has been pursued day by day and year by year by a most phenomenal and astonishing luckiness. He has been a shining soldier in all our wars for half a generation. He has littered his military life with blunders, and yet has never committed one that didn't make him a knight or a baronet or a lord or something. Look at his breast. Why, he is just clothed in domestic and foreign decorations. Well, sir, every one of them is a record of some shouting stupidity or other, and, taken together, They are proof that the very best thing in all this world that can befall a man is to be born lucky.
I say again, as I said at the banquet, Scoresby's an absolute fool. End of Luck by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. This is Section 7 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Dog's Tale by Mark Twain, Chapter 1, read by John Greenman. My father was a St. Bernard, my mother was a collie, but I am a Presbyterian. This is what my mother told me. I do not know these nice distinctions myself. To me they are only fine large words meaning nothing. My mother had a fondness for such. She liked to say them, and see other dogs look surprised and envious, as wondering how she got so much education. But, indeed, it was not real education, it was only show. She got the words by listening in the dining-room and drawing-room when there was company, and by going with the children to Sunday school and listening there. And whenever she heard a large word, she said it over to herself many times, and so was able to keep it until there was a dogmatic gathering in the neighborhood. Then she would get it off, and surprise and distress them all, from pocket pup to mastiff, which rewarded her for all her trouble. If there was a stranger, he was nearly sure to be suspicious, and when he got his breath again he would ask her what it meant. And she always told him. He was never expecting this, but thought he would catch her, so when she told him, he was the one that looked ashamed, whereas he had thought it was going to be she. The others were always waiting for this, and glad of it, and proud of her, for they knew what was going to happen, because they had had experience. When she told the meaning of a big word, they were all so taken up with admiration that it never occurred to any dog to doubt if it was the right one, and that was natural, because, for one thing, she answered up so promptly that it seemed like a dictionary speaking, and for another thing, where could they find out whether it was right or not? For she was the only cultivated dog there was. By and by, when I was older, she brought home the word unintellectual one time, and worked it pretty hard all the week at different gatherings, making much unhappiness and despondency. And it was at this time that I noticed that during that week she was asked for the meaning at 8 different assemblages, and flashed out a fresh definition every time, which showed me that she had more presence of mind than culture, though I said nothing, of course. She had one word which she always kept on hand and ready, like a life-preserver, a kind of emergency word to strap on when she was likely to get washed overboard in a sudden way. That was the word synonymous. When she happened to fetch out a long word which had had its day weeks before, and its prepared meanings gone to her dump-pile, if there was a stranger there, of course it knocked him groggy for a couple of minutes. Then he would come to, and by that time she would be away down wind on another tack, and not expecting anything. So when he'd hail and ask her to cash in, I, the only dog on the inside of her game, could see her canvas flicker a moment, but only just a moment. Then it would belly out taut and full, and she would say, as calm as a summer's day, "It's synonymous with supererogation," or some godless long reptile of a word like that, and go placidly about and skim away on the next tack, perfectly comfortable, you know, and leave that stranger looking profane and embarrassed, and the initiated slatting the floor with their tails in unison, and their faces transfigured with a holy joy. And it was the same with phrases. She would drag home a whole phrase, if it had a grand sound, and play it 6 nights and 2 matinees, and explain it a new way every time, which she had to, for all she cared for was the phrase. She wasn't interested in what it meant, and knew those dogs hadn't wit enough to catch her anyway. Yes, she was a daisy. She got so she wasn't afraid of anything, she had such confidence in the ignorance of those creatures. She even brought anecdotes that she had heard the family and the dinner guests laugh and shout over, and as a rule she got the nub of one chestnut hitched on to another chestnut, where, of course, it didn't fit and hadn't any point.
And when she delivered the nub she fell over and rolled on the floor and laughed and barked in the most insane way, while I could see that she was wondering to herself why it didn't seem as funny as it did when she first heard it. But no harm was done. The others rolled and barked too, privately ashamed of themselves for not seeing the point, and never suspecting that the fault was not with them, and there wasn't any to see. You can see by these things that she was of a rather vain and frivolous character. Still she had virtues, and enough to make up, I think. She had a kind heart and gentle ways, and never harbored resentments for injuries done her, but put them easily out of her mind and forgot them. And she taught her children her kindly way, and from her we learned also to be brave and prompt in time of danger, and not to run away, but face the peril that threatened friend or stranger, and help him the best we could without stopping to think what the cost might be to us. And she taught us not by words only, but by example, and that is the best way, and the surest, and the most lasting. Why, the brave things she did, the splendid things! She was just a soldier, and so modest about it. Well, you couldn't help admiring her, and you couldn't help imitating her. Not even a King Charles spaniel could remain entirely despicable in her society. So, as you see, there was more to her than her education. Chapter 2. When I was well grown at last, I was sold and taken away, and I never saw her again. She was broken-hearted, and so was I, and we cried. But she comforted me as well as she could, and said we were sent into this world for a wise and good purpose, and must do our duties without repining, take our life as we might find it, live it for the best good of others, and never mind about the results. They were not our affair. She said men who did like this would have a noble and beautiful reward by and by in another world, and although we animals would not go there, to do well and right without reward would give to our brief lives a worthiness and dignity which in itself would be a reward. She had gathered these things from time to time when she had gone to the Sunday school with the children, and had laid them up in her memory more carefully than she had done with those other words and phrases, and she had studied them deeply for her good and ours. One may see by this that she had a wise and thoughtful head, for all there was so much lightness and vanity in it. So we said our farewells, and looked our last upon each other through our tears, and the last thing she said, keeping it for the last to make me remember it the better, I think, was, "In memory of me, when there is a time of danger to another, do not think of yourself. Think of your mother, and do as she would do." Do you think I could forget that? No. Chapter 3. It was such a charming home, my new one, a fine great house with pictures and delicate decorations and rich furniture, and no gloom anywhere, but all the wilderness of dainty colors lit up with flooding sunshine. And the spacious grounds around it, and the great garden, oh, greensward and noble trees and flowers no end. And I was the same as a member of the family, and they loved me and petted me, and did not give me a new name, but called me by my old one, that was dear to me, because my mother had given it me, Aileen Mavourneen. She got it out of a song, and the Grays knew that song, and said it was a beautiful name. Mrs. Gray was 30, and so sweet and so lovely, you cannot imagine it. And Sadie was 10, and just like her mother, just a darling slender little copy of her, with auburn tails down her back, and short frocks. And the baby was a year old, and plump and dimpled, and fond of me, and never could get enough of hauling on my tail, and hugging me, and laughing out its innocent happiness. And Mr. Gray was 38, and tall and slender and handsome, a little bald in front, alert, quick in his movements, businesslike, prompt, decided, unsentimental, and with that kind of trim chiseled face that just seems to glint and sparkle with frosty intellectuality. He was a renowned scientist. I do not know what the word means, but my mother would know how to use it and get effects. She would know how to depress a rat-terrier with it, and make a lap-dog look sorry he came. But That is not the best one. The best one was laboratory. My mother could organize a trust on that one that would skin the tax collars off the whole herd. The laboratory was not a book, or a picture, or a place to wash your hands in, as the college president's dog said. No, that is the lavatory. The laboratory is quite different, and is filled with jars and bottles and electrics and wires and strange machines, and every week other scientists came there and sat in the place and used the machines and discussed and made what they called experiments and discoveries, and often I came too, and stood around and listened, and tried to learn, for the sake of my mother, and in loving memory of her, although it was a pain to me, as realizing what she was losing out of her life and I gaining nothing at all, for try as I might, I was never able to make anything out of it at all. Other times I lay on the floor in the mistress's workroom and slept, she gently using me for a footstool, knowing it pleased me, for it was a caress. Other times I spent an hour in the nursery, and got well tousled and made happy. Other times I watched by the crib there, when the baby was asleep and the nurse out for a few minutes on the baby's affairs. Other times I romped and raced through the grounds and the garden with Sadie till we were tired out, then slumbered on the grass in the shade of a tree while she read her book. Other times I went visiting among the neighbor dogs, for there were some most pleasant ones not far away, and one very handsome and courteous and graceful one, a curly-haired Irish setter by the name of Robin Adair, who was a Presbyterian like me, and belonged to the Scotch minister. The servants in our house were all kind to me, and were fond of me, and so, as you see, mine was a pleasant life. There could not be a happier dog than I was, nor a gratefuller one. I will say this for myself, for it is only the truth. I tried in all ways to do well and right, and honor my mother's memory and her teachings, and earn the happiness that had come to me as best I could. By and by came my little puppy, and then my cup was full, my happiness was perfect. It was the dearest little waddling thing, and so smooth and soft and velvety, and had such cunning little awkward paws, and such affectionate eyes, and such a sweet and innocent face, and it made me so proud to see how the children and their mother adored it, and fondled it, and exclaimed over every little wonderful thing it did. It did seem to me that life was just too lovely to— Then came the winter. One day I was standing a watch in the nursery. That is to say, I was asleep on the bed. The baby was asleep in the crib, which was alongside the bed, on the side next to the fireplace. It was the kind of crib that has a lofty tent over it made of gauzy stuff that you can see through. The nurse was out, and we two sleepers were alone. A spark from the wood fire was shot out, and it lit on the slope of the tent. I suppose a quiet interval followed, then a scream from the baby awoke me, and there was that tent flaming up toward the ceiling. Before I could think, I sprang to the floor in my fright, and in a second was halfway to the door, but in the next half-second my mother's farewell was sounding in my ears, and I was back on the bed again. I reached my head through the flames, and dragged the baby out by the waistband, and tugged it along, and we fell to the floor together in a cloud of smoke. I snatched a new hold, and dragged the screaming little creature along and out at the door and around the bend of the hall, and was still tugging away, all excited and happy and proud, when the master's voice shouted, "Begone, you cursed beast!" and I jumped to save myself, but he was wonderfully quick, and chased me up, striking furiously at me with his cane, I dodging this way and that, in terror, and at last a strong blow fell upon my left foreleg, which made me shriek and fall, for the moment, helpless. The cane went up for another blow, but never descended, for the nurse's voice rang wildly out, "The nursery's on fire!" and the master rushed away in that direction, and my other bones were saved. The pain was cruel, but no matter, I must not lose any time. He might come back at any moment, so I limped on 3 legs to the other end of the hall, where there was a dark little stairway leading up into a garret, where old boxes and such things were kept, as I had heard say, and where people seldom went. I managed to climb up there,
Then I searched my way through the dark among the piles of things, and hid in the secretest place I could find. It was foolish to be afraid there, yet still I was, so afraid that I held in and hardly even whimpered, though it would have been such a comfort to whimper, because that eases the pain, you know. But I could lick my leg, and that did me some good. For half an hour there was a commotion downstairs, and shoutings and rushing footsteps, and then there was quiet again. Quiet for some minutes, and that was grateful to my spirit, for then my fears began to go down, and fears are worse than pains, oh, much worse. Then came a sound that froze me. They were calling me by name, hunting for me. It was muffled by distance, but that could not take the terror out of it, and it was the most dreadful sound to me that I had ever heard. It went all about, everywhere down there, along the halls, through all the rooms, in both stories, and in the basement and the cellar, then outside and farther away, then back, and all about the house again, and I thought it would never, never stop. But at last it did, hours and hours after the vague twilight of the garret had long ago been blotted out by black darkness. Then in that blessed stillness my terrors fell little by little away, and I was at peace, and slept. It was a good rest I had, but I woke before the twilight had come again. I was feeling fairly comfortable, and I could think out a plan now. I made a very good one, which was to creep down, all the way down the back stairs, and hide behind the cellar door, and slip out and escape when the iceman came at dawn, while he was inside filling the refrigerator. Then I would hide all day, and start on my journey when night came. My journey to, well, anywhere where they would not know me and betray me to the master. I was feeling almost cheerful now. Then suddenly I thought, why, what would life be without my puppy? That was despair. There was no plan for me, I saw that. I must stay where I was. Stay and wait and take what might come. It was not my affair. That was what life is. My mother had said it. Then the calling began again. All my sorrows came back. I said to myself, the master will never forgive. I did not know what I had done to make him so bitter and so unforgiving, yet I judged it was something a dog could not understand, but which was clear to a man, and dreadful. They called and called, days and nights, it seemed to me, so long that the hunger and thirst near drove me mad, and I recognized that I was getting very weak. When you are this way you sleep a great deal, and I did. Once I woke in an awful fright. It seemed to me that the calling was right there in the garret, and so it was. It was Sadie's voice, and she was crying. My name was falling from her lips all broken, poor thing, and I could not believe my ears for the joy of it when I heard her say, "Come back to us, oh, come back to us, and forgive. It is all so sad without our—" I broke in with such a grateful little yelp, and the next moment Sadie was plunging and stumbling through the darkness and the lumber, and shouting for the family to hear, "She's found! She's found!" The days that followed, well, they were wonderful. The mother and Sadie and the servants, why, they just seemed to worship me. They couldn't seem to make me a bed that was fine enough, and as for food, they couldn't be satisfied with anything but game and delicacies that were out of season, and every day the friends and neighbors flocked in to hear about my heroism. That was the name they called it by, and it means agriculture. I remember my mother pulling it on a kennel once and explaining it in that way, but didn't say what agriculture was, except that it was synonymous with intramural incandescence, and a dozen times a day Mrs. Gray and Sadie would tell the tale to newcomers and say I risked my life to save the babies, and both of us had burns to prove it, and then the company would pass me around and pet me and exclaim about me, and you could see the pride in the eyes of Sadie and her mother, and when the people wanted to know what made me limp, they looked ashamed and changed the subject, and sometimes when people hunted them this way and that way with questions about it, it looked to me as if they were going to cry. And this was not all the glory. No, the master's friends came, a whole 20 of the most distinguished people, and had me in the laboratory, and discussed me as if I was a kind of discovery, and some of them said it was wonderful in a dumb beast, the finest exhibition of instinct they could call to mind. But the master said with vehemence, "It's far above instinct. It's reason. And many a man, privileged to be saved and go with you and me to a better world by right of its possession, has less of it than this poor silly quadruped that's foredaigned to perish." And then he laughed and said, "Why, look at me. I'm a sarcasm. Bless you, with all my grand intelligence, the only thing I inferred was that the dog had gone mad and was destroying the child, whereas, but for the beast's intelligence, its reason, I tell you, the child would have perished." They disputed and disputed, and I was the very center of subject of it all, and I wished my mother could know that this grand honor had come to me. It would have made her proud. Then they discussed optics, as they called it, and whether a certain injury to the brain would produce blindness or not, but they could not agree about it, and said they must test it by experiment by and by. And next they discussed plants, and that interested me, because in the summer Sadie and I had planted seeds. I helped her dig the holes, you know. And after days and days a little shrub or a flower came up there, and it was a wonder how that could happen, but it did, and I wished I could talk. I would have told those people about it and shown them how much I knew, and been all alive with the subject, but I didn't care for the optics. It was dull, and when they came back to it again it bored me, and I went to sleep. Pretty soon it was spring, and sunny and pleasant and lovely, and the sweet mother and the children patted me and the puppy good-bye, and went away on a journey and a visit to their kin, and the master wasn't any company for us, but we played together and had good times, and the servants were kind and friendly, so we got along quite happily and counted the days and waited for the family. And one day those men came again and said, "Now for the test," and they took the puppy to the laboratory, and I limped three-leggedly along, too, feeling proud, for any attention shown to the puppy was a pleasure to me, of course. They discussed and experimented, and then suddenly the puppy shrieked, and they set him on the floor, and he went staggering around with his head all bloody, and the master clapped his hands and shouted, "There, I've won, confess it, he's as blind as a bat." And they all said, "It's so, you've proved your theory, and suffering humanity owes you a great debt from henceforth." And they crowded around him, and wrung his hand cordially and thankfully, and praised him. But I hardly saw or heard these things, for I ran at once to my little darling, and snuggled close to it where it lay, and licked the blood, and it put its head against mine, whimpering softly, and I knew in my heart it was a comfort to it in its pain and trouble to feel its mother's touch, though it could not see me. Then it dropped down, presently, and its little velvet nose rested upon the floor, and it was still, and did not move any more. Soon the master stopped discussing a moment, and rang in the footman, and said, "Bury it in the far corner of the garden," and then went on with the discussion, and I trotted after the footman, very happy and grateful, for I knew the puppy was out of its pain now, because it was asleep. We went far down the garden to the farthest end, where the children and the nurse and the puppy and I used to play in the summer in the shade of a great elm, and there the footman dug a hole, and I saw he was going to plant the puppy, and I was glad, because it would grow and come up a fine handsome dog like Robin Adair, and be a beautiful surprise for the family when they came home. So I tried to help him dig, but my lame leg was no good, being stiff, you know, and you have to have two, or it is no use. When the footman had finished and covered little Robin up, he patted my head, and there were tears in his eyes, and he said, "Poor little doggie, you saved his child." I have watched 2 whole weeks, and he doesn't come up. This last week a fright has been stealing upon me. I think there is something terrible about this. I do not know what it is, but the fear makes me sick, and I cannot eat, though the servants bring me the best of food, and they pet me so, and even come in the night and cry and say, "Poor doggie, do give it up and come home, don't break our hearts." and all this terrifies me the more, and makes me sure something has happened, and I am so weak. Since yesterday I cannot stand on my feet any more, and within this hour the servants, looking toward the sun where it was sinking out of sight, and the night chill coming on, said things I could not understand, but they carried something cold to my heart. Those poor creatures, they do not suspect. They will come home in the morning and eagerly ask for the little doggie that did the brave deed, and who of us will be strong enough to say the truth to them? The humble little friend is gone where go the beasts that perish.
The End of A Dog's Tale by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. This is Section 8 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. Lost in the Snow by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. We mounted and started. The snow lay so deep on the ground that there was no sign of a road perceptible, and the snowfall was so thick that we could not see more than 100 yards ahead, else we could have guided our course by the mountain ranges. The case looked dubious, but Ollendorf said his instinct was as sensitive as any compass, and that he could strike a bee-line for Carson City and never diverge from it. He said that if he were to straggle a single point out of the true line, his instinct would assail him like an outraged conscience. Consequently, we dropped into his wake, happy and content. For half an hour we poked along warily enough, but at the end of that time we came upon a fresh trail, and Ollendorf shouted proudly, "I knew I was as dead certain as a compass, boys! Here we are, right in somebody's tracks that will hunt the way for us without any trouble. Let's hurry up and join company with the party." So we put the horses into as much of a trot as the deep snow would allow, and before long it was evident that we were gaining on our predecessors, for the tracks grew more distinct. We hurried along, and at the end of an hour the tracks looked still newer and fresher, but what surprised us was that the number of travelers in advance of us seemed to steadily increase. We wondered how so large a party came to be traveling at such a time and in such a solitude. Somebody suggested that it must be a company of soldiers from the fort, and so we accepted that solution and jogged along a little faster still, for they could not be far off now. But the tracks still multiplied, and we began to think the platoon of soldiers was miraculously expanding into a regiment. Ballou said they had already increased to 500. Presently he stopped his horse and said, "Boys, these are our own tracks, and we've actually been circusing round and round in a circle for more than 2 hours, out here in this blind desert. By George, this is perfectly hydraulic." Then the old man waxed wroth and abusive. He called Ollendorf all manner of hard names, said he never saw such a lurid fool as he was, and ended with a peculiarly venomous opinion that he did not know as much as a logarithm. We certainly had been following our own tracks. Ollendorf and his mental compass were in disgrace from that moment. After all our hard travel, here we were on the bank of the stream again, with the inn beyond dimly outlined through the driving snowfall. While we were considering what to do, the young Swede landed from the canoe and took his pedestrian way Carsonwards, singing his same tiresome song about his sister and his brother, and the child in the grave with its mother, and in a short minute faded and disappeared in the white oblivion. He was never heard of again. He no doubt got bewildered and lost, and fatigue delivered him over to sleep, and sleep betrayed him to death. Possibly he followed our treacherous tracks till he became exhausted and dropped. Presently the overland stage forded the now fast receding stream and started toward Carson on its first trip since the flood came. We hesitated no longer now, but took up our march in its wake, and trotted merrily along, for we had good confidence in the driver's bump of locality. But our horses were no match for the fresh stage team. We were soon left out of sight, but it was no matter, for we had the deep ruts the wheels made for a guide. By this time it was 3 in the afternoon, and consequently it was not very long before night came, and not with a lingering twilight, but with a sudden shutting down like a cellar door, as is its habit in that country. The snowfall was still as thick as ever, and of course we could not see 15 steps before us, but all about us the white glare of the snow bed enabled us to discern the smooth sugar-loaf mounds made by the covered sage bushes, and just in front of us the 2 faint grooves which we knew were the steadily filling and slowly disappearing wheel tracks. Now those sage bushes were all about the same height, 3 or 4 feet. They stood just about 7 feet apart, all over the vast desert. Each of them was a mere snow mound now, in any direction that you proceeded, the same as in a well-laid-out orchard. You would find yourself moving down a distinctly defined avenue, with a row of these snow mounds on either side of it, an avenue the customary width of a road, nice and level in its breadth, and rising at the sides in the most natural way by reason of the mounds. But we had not thought of this. Then imagine the chilly thrill that shot through us when it finally occurred to us, far in the night, that since the last faint trace of the wheel tracks had long ago been buried from sight, we might now be wandering down a mere sagebrush avenue miles away from the road, and diverging further and further away from it all the time. Having a cake of ice slipped down one's back is placid comfort compared to it. There was a sudden leap and stir of blood that had been asleep for an hour, and a sudden arousing of all the drowsing activities in our minds and bodies. We were alive and awake at once, and shaking and quaking with consternation, too. There was an instant halting and dismounting, a bending low and an anxious scanning of the roadbed. Useless, of course, for if a faint depression could not be discerned from an altitude of 4 or 5 feet above it, it certainly could not with one's nose nearly against it. We seemed to be in a road, but that was no proof. We tested this by walking off in various directions. The regular snow mounds and the regular avenues between them convinced each man that he had found the true road, and that the others had found only false ones. Plainly the situation was desperate. We were cold and stiff, and the horses were tired. We decided to build a sage-brush fire and camp out till morning. This was wise, because if we were wandering from the right road and the snowstorm continued another day, our case would be the next thing to hopeless if we kept on. All agreed that a campfire was what would come nearest to saving us now, and so we set about building it. We could find no matches, and so we tried to make shift with the pistols. Not a man in the party had ever tried to do such a thing before, but not a man in the party doubted that it could be done, and without any trouble, because every man in the party had read about it in books many a time, and had naturally come to believe it, with trusting simplicity, just as he had long ago accepted and believed that other common book fraud about Indians and lost hunters making a fire by rubbing 2 dry sticks together. We huddled together on our knees in the deep snow, and the horses put their noses together and bowed their patient heads over us, and while the feathery flakes eddied down and turned us into a group of white statuary, we proceeded with the momentous experiment. We broke twigs from a sagebrush and piled them on a little cleared place in the shelter of our bodies. In the course of 10 or 15 minutes all was ready, and then, while conversation ceased and our pulses beat low with anxious suspense, Ollendorf applied his revolver, pulled the trigger, and blew the pile clear out of the county. It was the flattest failure that ever was. Now, this was distressing, but it paled before a greater horror. The horses were gone. I had been appointed to hold the bridles, but in my absorbing anxiety over the pistol experiment I had unconsciously dropped them, and the released animals had walked off in the storm. It was useless to try to follow them, for their footfalls could make no sound, and one could pass within 2 yards of the creatures and never see them. We gave them up without an effort at recovering them,
and cursed the lying books that said horses would stay by their masters for protection and companionship in a distressful time like ours. We were miserable enough before. We felt still more forlorn now. Patiently, but with blighted hope, we broke more sticks and piled them, and once more the Prussian shot them into annihilation. Plainly, to light a fire with a pistol was an art requiring practice and experience, and the middle of a desert at midnight in a snowstorm was not a good place or time for the acquiring of the accomplishment. We gave it up and tried the other. Each man took a couple of sticks and fell to chafing them together. At the end of half an hour we were thoroughly chilled, and so were the sticks. We bitterly execrated the Indians, the hunters, and the books that had betrayed us with the silly device, and wondered dismally what was next to be done. At this critical moment Mr. Ballou fished out 4 matches from the rubbish of an overlooked pocket. To have found 4 gold bars would have seemed poor and cheap good luck compared to this. One cannot think how good a match looks under such circumstances, or how lovable and precious and sacredly beautiful to the eye. This time we gathered sticks with high hopes, and when Mr. Ballou prepared to light the first match, there was an amount of interest centered upon him that pages of writing could not describe. The match burnt hopefully a moment, and then went out. It could not have carried more regret with it if it had been a human life. The next match simply flashed and died. The wind puffed the third one out just as it was on the imminent verge of success. We gathered together closer than ever, and developed a solicitude that was rapt and painful, as Mr. Ballou scratched our last hope on his leg. It lit, burned blue and sickly, and then budded into a robust flame. Shading it with his hands, the old gentleman bent gradually down, and every heart went with him. Everybody, too, for that matter, and blood and breath stood still. The flame touched the sticks at last, took gradual hold upon them, hesitated, took a stronger hold, hesitated again, held its breath 5 heart-breaking seconds, then gave a sort of human gasp and went out. Nobody said a word for several minutes. It was a solemn sort of silence. Even the wind put on a stealthy, sinister quiet, and made no more noise than the falling flakes of snow. Finally a sad-voiced conversation began, and it was soon apparent that in each of our hearts lay the conviction that this was our last night with the living. I had so hoped that I was the only one who felt so. When the others calmly acknowledged their conviction, it sounded like the summons itself. Ollendorf said, "Brothers, let us die together, and let us go without one hard feeling towards each other. Let us forget and forgive bygones. I know that you have felt hard towards me for turning over the canoe, and for knowing too much and leading you round and round in the snow, but I meant well. Forgive me. I acknowledge freely that I have had hard feelings against Mr. Ballou for abusing me and calling me a logarithm, which is a thing I do not know what, but no doubt a thing considered disgraceful and unbecoming in America, and it has scarcely been out of my mind, and has hurt me a great deal. But let it go. I forgive Mr. Ballou with all my heart, and—" Poor Ollendorf broke down, and the tears came. He was not alone, for I was crying too, and so was Mr. Ballou. Ollendorf got his voice again and forgave me for things I had done and said. Then he got out his bottle of whiskey and said that whether he lived or died, he would never touch another drop. He said he had given up all hope of life, and although ill-prepared, was ready to submit humbly to his fate. That he wished he could be spared a little longer, not for any selfish reason, but to make a thorough reform in his character, and by devoting himself to helping the poor, nursing the sick, and pleading with the people to guard themselves against the evils of intemperance, make his life a beneficent example to the young, and lay it down at last with the precious reflection that it had not been lived in vain. He ended by saying that his reform should begin at this moment, even here in the presence of death, since no longer time was to be vouchsafed wherein to prosecute it to men's help and benefit, and with that he threw away the bottle of whiskey. Mr. Ballou made remarks of similar purport, and began the reform he could not live to continue, by throwing away the ancient pack of cards that had solaced our captivity during the flood and made it bearable. He said he never gambled, but still was satisfied that the meddling with cards in any way was immoral and injurious, and no man could be wholly pure and blemishless without eschewing them. "And therefore," continued he, "in doing this act, I already feel more in sympathy with that spiritual Saturnalia necessary to entire and obsolete reform." These rolling syllables touched him as no intelligible eloquence could have done, and the old man sobbed with a mournfulness not unmingled with satisfaction. My own remarks were of the same tenor as those of my comrades, and I know that the feelings that prompted them were heartfelt and sincere. We were all sincere, and all deeply moved and earnest, for we were in the presence of death, and without hope. I threw away my pipe, and in doing it felt that at last I was free of a hated vice, and one that had ridden me like a tyrant all my days. While I yet talked, the thought of the good I might have done in the world, and the still greater good I might now do, with these new incentives and higher and better aims to guide me, if I could only be spared a few years longer, overcame me, and the tears came again. We put our arms about each other's necks and awaited the warning drowsiness that precedes death by freezing. It came stealing over us presently, and then we bade each other a last farewell. A delicious dreaminess wrought its web about my yielding senses, while the snowflakes wove a winding sheet about my conquered body. Oblivion came. The battle of life was done. I do not know how long I was in a state of forgetfulness, but it seemed an age. A vague consciousness grew upon me by degrees, and then came a gathering anguish of pain in my limbs and through all my body. I shuddered. The thought flitted through my brain, "This is death. This is the hereafter." Then came a white upheaval at my side, and a voice said with bitterness, "Will some gentleman be so good as to kick me behind?" It was Ballou. At least it was a tousled snow image in a sitting posture with Ballou's voice. I rose up, and there in the gray dawn, not 15 steps from us, were the frame buildings of a stage station, and under a shed stood our still saddled and bridled horses. An arched snowdrift broke up now, and Ollendorf emerged from it, and the three of us sat and stared at the houses without speaking a word. We really had nothing to say. We were like the profane man who could not do the subject justice. The whole situation was so painfully ridiculous and humiliating that words were tame, and we did not know where to commence anyhow. The joy in our hearts at our deliverance was poisoned, well-nigh dissipated indeed. We presently began to grow pettish by degrees, and sullen, and then angry at each other, angry at ourselves, angry at everything in general. We moodily dusted the snow from our clothing, and in unsociable single file plowed our way to the horses, unsaddled them, and sought shelter in the station. I have scarcely exaggerated a detail of this curious and absurd adventure. It occurred almost exactly as I have stated it. We actually went into camp in a snowdrift in a desert, at midnight, in a storm, forlorn and hopeless, within 15 steps of a comfortable inn. For 2 hours we sat apart in the station and ruminated in disgust. The mystery was gone now, and it was plain enough why the horses had deserted us. Without a doubt, they were under that shed a quarter of a minute after they had left us, and they must have overheard and enjoyed all our confessions and lamentations. After breakfast we felt better, and the zest of life soon came back. The world looked bright again, and existence was as dear to us as ever. Presently an uneasiness came over me, grew upon me, assailed me without ceasing. Alas, my regeneration was not complete. I wanted to smoke. I resisted with all my strength, but the flesh was weak. I wandered away alone and wrestled with myself an hour. I recalled my promise of reform, and preached to myself persuasively, upbraidingly, exhaustively. But it was all in vain. I shortly found myself sneaking among the snowdrifts hunting for my pipe. I discovered it after a considerable search, and crept away to hide myself and enjoy it. I remained behind the barn a good while, asking myself how I would feel if my braver, stronger, truer comrades should catch me in my degradation. At last I lit the pipe, and no human being can feel meaner and baser than I did then. I was ashamed of being in my own pitiful company. Still dreading discovery, I felt that perhaps the further side of the barn would be somewhat safer, and so I turned the corner. As I turned the one corner, smoking, Ollendorf turned the other with his bottle to his lips, and between us sat unconscious Ballou, deep in a game of solitaire with the old greasy cards.
End of Lost in the Snow by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman. This is Section 9 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. Mark Twain on Overspeeding. Read by John Greenman.
Equal laws for all. It is good in theory, and I believe it would prove good in practice, if fairly and dispassionately tried. The law dresses a convict in a garb which makes him easily distinguishable from any moving thing in the world at 125 yards, except a zebra. If he escapes in those clothes, he cannot get far. Could not this principle be extended to include his brother criminal, the overspeeder, thus making the pair fairly and righteously equal before the law? Every day throughout America, the overspeeder runs over somebody and escapes. That is the way it reads. At present, the mobile numbers are so small that ordinary eyes cannot read them upon a swiftly receding machine at a distance of 100 feet, a distance which the machine has covered before the spectator can adjust his focus. I think I would amend the law. I would enlarge the figures, and make them readable at 100 yards. For overspeeding, first offense, I would enlarge the figures again, and make them readable at 300 yards. This is in place of a fine, and as a warning to pedestrians to climb a tree. This enlargement to continue 2 months, with privilege of resuming the smaller figures after the first 30 days upon payment of $500. For each subsequent offense, re-enlargement for 6 months, with privilege of resuming the smaller figures upon payment of $1,000 at the end of 3, with auto numbers readable as far as one could tell a convict from a barber pole. None of these criminals could run over a person and escape. 2 months ago, a touring mobile came within an indeterminable fraction of killing a member of my family, and its number was out of sight range before the sharpest eyes present could make it out. It was so small, and the spectators so dazed by momentary fright. I have had 2 narrow escapes in New York, and so has everybody else. None of us has succeeded in capturing the auto number. I feel a sort of personal interest in this suggested reform.
End of Mark Twain on Overspeeding. Reprinted from Harper's Weekly in Life magazine of November 30th, 1905. Read by John Greenman. This is Chapter 10 of Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain's Journal Writings, Volume 2, A Medieval Romance. Read by John Greenman. We voyaged by steamer down the Lago de Lecho, through wild mountain scenery and by hamlets and villas, and disembarked at the town of Lecho. They said it was 2 hours by carriage to the ancient city of Bergamo, and that we should arrive there in good season for the railway train. We got an open barouche and a wild, boisterous driver, and set out. It was delightful. We had a fast team and a perfectly smooth road. There were towering cliffs on our left, and the pretty Lago de Lecho on our right, and every now and then it rained on us. Just before starting, the driver picked up in the street a stump of cigar an inch long, and put it in his mouth. When he had carried it thus for about an hour, I thought it would be only Christian charity to give him a light. I handed him my cigar, which I had just lit, and he put it in his mouth and returned his stump to his pocket. We saw interior Italy now. The houses were of solid stone, and not often in good repair. The peasants and their children were idle as a general thing, and the donkeys and chickens made themselves at home in drawing-room and bedchamber, and were not molested. The drivers of each and every one of the slow-moving market carts we met were stretched in the sun upon their merchandise, sound asleep. Every 300 or 400 yards, it seemed to me, we came upon the shrine of some saint or other, a rude picture of him built into a cross or a stone pillar by the roadside. Some of the pictures of the Savior were curiosities in their way. They represented him stretched upon the cross, his countenance distorted with agony. From the wounds of the crown of thorns, from the pierced side, from the mutilated hands and feet, from the scourged body, from every handbreadth of his person streams of blood were pouring. Such a gory, ghastly spectacle would frighten the children out of their senses, I should think. There were some unique auxiliaries to the painting, which added to the effect. These were genuine wooden and iron implements, and were prominently disposed about the figures, a bundle of nails, the hammer to drive them, the sponge, the reed that supported it, the cup of vinegar, the ladder for the ascent of the cross, the spear that pierced the Saviour's side. The crown of thorns was made of real thorns and was nailed to the sacred head. In some of the Italian church paintings, even by the old masters, the Saviour and the Virgin wear silver or gilded crowns that are fastened to the pictures' heads with nails. The effect is as grotesque as it is incongruous. Here and there in the fronts of roadside inns we found huge, coarse frescoes of suffering martyrs like those in the shrines. It could not have diminished their sufferings any to be so uncouthly represented. We were in the heart and home of priestcraft, of a happy, cheerful, contented ignorance, superstition, degradation, poverty, indolence, and everlasting, unaspiring worthlessness. And we said fervently, it suits these people precisely, let them enjoy it, along with other animals, and heaven forbid that they be molested. We feel no malice towards them. We passed through the strangest, funniest, undreamt-of old towns, wedded to the customs and steeped in the sleep of the older ages, and perfectly unaware that the world turns round. And perfectly indifferent, too, as to whether it turns round or stands still. They have nothing to do but to eat and sleep and eat, and toil a little when they can get a friend to stand by and keep them awake. They are not paid for thinking. They are not paid to fret about the world's concerns. They were not respectable people. They were not worthy people. They were not learned and wise and brilliant people. But in their breasts all their stupid lives long rested a peace that passeth all understanding. How can men, calling themselves men, consent to be so degraded and happy? We whisked by many a gray old medieval castle, clad thick with ivy that swung its green banners down from towers and turrets where once some old crusader's flag had floated. The driver pointed to one of these ancient fortresses and said, I translate,
Do you see that great iron hook that projects from the wall just under the highest window in the ruined tower? We said we could not see it at such a distance, but had no doubt it was there. Well, he said, there is a legend connected with that iron hook. Nearly 700 years ago that castle was the property of the noble Count Luigi Gennaro Guido Alfonse de Genova. What was his other name? Said one of the party. He had no other name. The name I have spoken of was all the name he had. He was the son of blank. Never mind the particulars. Go on with the legend. The legend. Well, then, all the world at that time was in a wild excitement about the Holy Sepulchre. All the great feudal lords in Europe were pledging their lands and pawning their plate to fit out men-at-arms so that they might join the grand armies of Christendom and win renown in the holy wars. The Count Luigi raised money, like the rest, and one mild September morning, armed with battle-axe, with barbican, cresset, portcullis, Enfield rifle, Prussian needle-gun, and thundering culverin, he rode through the greaves of his donjon keep with as gallant a troop of Christian bandits as ever stepped in Italy. He had his sword Excalibur with him. His beautiful countess and her young daughter waved him a tearful adieu from the battering rams and buttresses of the fortress, and he galloped away with a happy heart. He made a raid on a neighboring baron, and completed his outfit with the booty secured. He then razed the castle to the ground, massacred the family, and moved on. They were hardy fellows in the grand old days of chivalry. Alas, those days will never come again. Count Luigi grew high in fame in the Holy Land. He plunged into the carnage of 100 battles, but his good Excalibur always brought him out alive, albeit often sorely wounded. His face became browned by exposure to the Syrian sun in long marches. He suffered hunger and thirst. He pined in prisons. He languished in loathsome plague hospitals. And many and many a time he thought of his loved ones at home and wondered if all was well with them. But his heart said, "Peace! Is not thy brother watching over thy household?" 42 years waxed and waned. The good fight was on. Godfrey reigned in Jerusalem. The Christian hosts reared the banner of the cross above the Holy Sepulchre. Twilight was approaching. 50 harlequins in flowing robes approached this castle wearily, for they were on foot, and the dust upon their garments showed that they had traveled far. They overtook a peasant and asked him if it was likely they could get food and a hospitable bed there, for love of Christian charity, and if perchance a moral parlor entertainment might meet with generous countenance. For, they said, this exhibition hath no feature that could offend the most fastidious. Marry, quoth the peasant, an it please your worships, ye had better go many a good road hence with your juggling circus than trust your bones in yonder castle. How now, sirrah, exclaimed the chief monk, explain thy ribald speech, or, my lady, it shall go hard with thee. Peace, good mountebank, I did but utter the truth that was in my heart. San Pablo be my witness that did ye but find the stout Count Leonardo and his cups, sheer from the castle's topmost battlements would he hurl ye all. Alack-a-day, the good Lord Luigi reigns not here in these sad times. The good Lord Luigi? Aye, none other, please your worship. In his day the poor rejoiced in plenty, and the rich he did oppress. Taxes were not known. The fathers of the church waxed fat upon his bounty. Travelers went and came with none to interfere. Whosoever would might tarry in his halls in cordial welcome, and eat his bread and drink his wine withal. But woe is me, 42 years agone the good Count rode away to fight for the Holy Cross, and many a year has flown since word or token was had of him. Men say his bones lie bleaching in the fields of Palestine. And now? Now? God mercy, the cruel Leonardo lords it in the castle.
He wrings taxes from the poor, he robs all travelers that journey by his gates, he spends his days in feuds and murders, and his nights in revel and debauch. He roasts the fathers of the church upon his kitchen spits, and enjoyeth the same, calling it pastime. These 30 years Luigi's countess hath not been seen by any in all this land, and many whisper that she pines in the dungeons of the castle for that she will not wed with Leonardo, saying that she will die ere she prove false to him. They whisper likewise that her daughter is a prisoner as well. Nay, good jugglers, seek ye refreshments otherwheres. 'Twere better that ye perished in a Christian war than that ye plunged from off yon dizzy tower. I give ye good day. God keep ye, gentle youth, farewell." But, heedless of the peasant's warning, the players moved straightway towards the castle. Word was brought to Count Leonardo that a company of mountebanks besought his hospitality. "'Tis well, dispose of them in the customary manner. Yet stay, I have need of them. Let them come hither. Later cast them from the battlements. Or, how many priests have ye on hand?" "The day's results are meagre, good my lord. An abbot and a dozen beggarly friars is all we have." "Hell and furies! Is the state going to secede? Send hither the mountebanks. Afterwards broil them with the priests." The robed and close-cowled harlequins entered. The grim Leonardo sate in state at the head of his council board. Ranged up and down the hall on either hand stood near 100 men-at-arms. "Ha, villains!" quoth the Count, "what can ye do to earn the hospitality ye crave? Dread lord and mighty, crowded audiences have greeted our humble efforts with rapturous applause. Among our body count we the versatile and talented Ugolino, the justly celebrated Rodolfo, the infant phenomenon Signor Beppo, the Palestine pet Zelina, the gifted and accomplished Rodrigo. The management have spared no pains and expense—" "'Sdeath! What can ye do? Curb thy prating tongue." "Good my lord, in acrobatic feats, in practice with the dumb-bells, in balancing and ground and lofty tumbling are we versed. And sith your highness asked me, I venture here to publish that in the truly marvelous and entertaining Zampillero station—" "Gag him! Throttle him! Body of Bacchus, am I a dog that I am to be assailed with polysyllabled blasphemy like this? But hold! Lucretia, Isabel, stand forth. Sirrah, behold this dame, this weeping wench. The first I marry within the hour, the other shall dry her tears or feed the vultures. Thou and thy vagabonds shall crown the wedding with thy merrymakings. Fetch hither the priest." The dame sprang toward the chief player. "Oh, save me!" she cried. "Save me from a fate far worse than death. Behold these sad eyes, these shrunken cheeks, this withered frame. See thou this wreck this fiend hath made, and let thy heart be moved with pity. Look upon this damsel, note her wasted form, her halting step, her bloodless cheek, where youth should blush and happiness exult in smiles. Hear us and have compassion. This monster was my husband's brother. He should have been our shield against all harm, hath kept us shut within the noisome dungeon of his castle for lo, these 30 years. For what crime? None other than I would not belie my troth, root out my strong love for him who marches with the legions of the cross in Holy Land, for oh, he is not dead, and wed with him. Save us, oh, save thy persecuted supplicants." She flung herself at his feet and clasped his knees. "Ha, ha, ha!" shouted the brutal Leonardo. "Priest, to thy work!" and he dragged the weeping dame from her refuge. "Say once for all, will you be mine? For by my halidome, that breath that uttereth thy refusal shall be thy last on earth." "Never!" "Then die!" and the sword leapt from its scabbard. Quicker than thought, quicker than the lightning's flash,
50 monkish habits disappeared, and 50 knights in splendid armor stood revealed. 50 falchions gleamed in air above the men-at-arms, and brighter, fiercer than them all, flamed Excalibur aloft, and cleaving downward, struck the brutal Leonardo's weapon from his grasp. Count Luigi bound his usurping brother hand and foot. The practiced knights from Palestine made holiday sport of carving the awkward men-at-arms to chops and steaks. The victory was complete. Happiness reigned. Everybody married somebody else. But what did they do with the wicked brother? Oh, nothing, only hanged him on that iron hook I was speaking of, by the chin. How? Passed it up through into his mouth. How long? Couple of years. Count Luigi, is he dead? 650 years ago, or such a matter. Splendid legend. Drive on.
End of A Medieval Romance by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman.